a radical, not to say extreme plan to expand the war in Gaza, and signs of distance between Donald Trump and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. It's unholy. I'm Jonathan Friedland in London.
And I'm Yonit Levy in Tel Aviv. Unholy, two Jews on the news. An announcement before we begin, just to remind our listeners, London, June 8th. Just be there. It's going to be very cool. Our very first Unholy live event at the Queen Elizabeth Hall. Yuval Noah Harari, historian, author, intellectual, oracle, 2 stars from the entertainment world, actor Andy Nyman, and singer Mira Awad. It's going to be fantastic. My only issue right now is that I don't have the perfect suit, so I will leave Jonathan to do his podcast. I will go and find my perfect suit.
Shopping.
Yes.
It
is important, Suits are important.
They are. So you've already revealed something there. You're going to be wearing a suit.
I will.
That's
Are you surprised?
That's a pre-show reveal.
Mm-hmm. I love suits. You know this about me. And I found the only job in the world where this is, my obsession has a outlet and an accelerant to my obsession of loving suits.
Yeah. What are the other jobs for women that require suits? I'm thinking Secretary of State for the United States in 2016 or so.
This gives me options. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, not 2016.
Future career trajectory.
So you've given, that's the first of many reveals. You've told us something of what you might be wearing, but also the lineup for our big show on the 8th of June in London. We're delighted to say, and this is usually sort of Donald Trump style hype, when you say there's only a very few tickets left. It has almost sold out, this show. Yeah. And there are very, very few tickets left. I think by the time you hear this, it may be too late. So you need to book up for that. Now, lots of news, which we're going to get to, especially with our guest.
Do you think we should change our podcast name to just There's a Lot Going On? I think so.
That would be popular, I think. That could really work. It's a bit late now, isn't it, to be proposing a name change?
Perhaps.
But yeah, you're right. It's a weekly refrain. There is a lot going on, but I think we had a few things that went on last week, which I think you wanted to sort of close out.
I mean, just that I know that a week feels like a year when we're talking about news coming out of this region, and it's very rare that we would go back to a story that we kind of talked about last week that also ended. But I do want to just talk a little bit more about the fires that we discussed last Wednesday in the Jerusalem vicinity. I'll remind our listeners a little bit. There was quite a lot of panic. Thankfully, no serious injuries, but a lot of concern. People evacuated from their houses, escaping their cars on the main highway, the Tel Aviv-Jerusalem highway. And what happened after we recorded, Jonathan, was actually, and please forgive television people for being self-involved. But what happened was that for the first time, our compound, the studios, which are situated in the Judean Hills, right where the fire was raging, had to be evacuated. Now, that never happened before, actually. I mean, there were wars and there were rockets and there were a lot of things going on, but this had never happened before. We had to evacuate the studio, and I anchored the news from a makeshift studio in Herzliya. And there was this moment where Israelis were kind of saying to themselves, what else could happen? The country, I think I wrote this to you, the country burning on Independence Day is a metaphor, one metaphor too many. You kind of want to find the screenwriter of the series Israel and say, listen, this is a little too much. I think you've exaggerated. Let's walk this back a little bit. So that was the feeling last week about this fire. As I said, no one seriously injured. Yes, about 5,000 acres burning, which is bad news for Israel. And the mood, as I said, was kind of like, what else can happen? Ever since we said that and asked that, there's been a teacher's strike and there's been a ballistic missile from Yemen to Ben Gurion Airport. We'll talk about that extensively in our conversation, but that was just a little bit of a feeling that I was left with.
I don't blame you. And it is quite true that sometimes the divine scriptwriter is a little on the nose when it comes to events in your neighborhood. I'll mention something actually from last week. April 2025 marked 25 years since the judgment came down in what's known as the David Irving case. It was the libel trial brought by David Irving against Deborah Lipstadt, who's been a guest on our podcast, a historian who had written a book about Holocaust denial and had named David Irving. He famously sued her for libel. It became this huge event in the early months of 2000. in which the world's media descended on Court 73, as I remember it, in the High Court in London for what was billed as the Holocaust on trial, the truth of the Holocaust. Last week, I had the great privilege of chairing a discussion between the key people involved in that fight against David Irving, Deborah Lipstadt herself, the lawyers Anthony Julius, also a guest on our podcast, and James Libson, and Sir David Hare, who wrote the screenplay for the movie Denial, all together on a stage, reflecting and remembering that extraordinary case. I had covered it as a reporter. It was there, many times. And just one thing about you saying about the scriptwriter is just sometimes a little on the nose. It reminded me of this simply for this reason. Deborah Lipstadt recalled a day that I was actually in court for when David Irving, who in the end was found to be a pro-Nazi polemicist, that was the word used by the judge, in one of the days of the proceedings, David Irving addressed the judge as Mein Führer. It was a slip of the tongue. Instead of saying Your Honor, he said Mein Führer. Apparently I said to Deborah Lipstadt at the time, forget all the content in the trial. That's what's going to be in the newspapers tomorrow. On the panel, Deborah Lipstadt turned to David Hare and said, why did you not include that in the film? It was such an amazing moment. And he said, I thought about it, but I knew if I put that in the movie, no one would believe it. They would all say, well, now you're making stuff up. Yep. Sometimes the scriptwriter for real outstrips the scriptwriter for fiction. And that was one of those examples. So memories of a turning point, really a big moment. I remember at the time thinking that was the end of something. I now fear rather it was the beginning of something. There are lots of David Irvings in our world now, faking news and making stuff up. But it was a very, very big moment here in London, and it was very good to be back with those people 25 years on. So as we are talking about the events of the last week, I thought I would throw in that one.
Right. But by the way, about writers and fiction and nonfiction, isn't that all of that the inspiration for To Kill the Truth?
Nice.
Sort of.
Reference.
Just plugging in Jonathan's books as we talk.
Yes. So To Kill the Truth by my alter egos. Very, very warm and generous co-host, really. And you're allowed to get as many suits as you want if you're saying that. Sam Bourne, my alter ego, wrote a novel called To Kill the Truth, and it was absolutely inspired by the Irving trial and the Irving phenomenon of what if somebody tried to not just doctor the historical record, but to destroy it entirely. And there's a kind of Irving-style character in there. So brilliant callback reference from you there. And very, very generous of you too. We should probably talk about what has been a very, very intense news period.
This has been a week in which Gaza was in the headlines and Yemen was in the headlines, and we wanted to just bring in our friend of the pod to discuss all this with. There's a lot to unpack in these past 7 days, so let's just go right into it.
We're joined by a longtime friend of the podcast and acclaimed military analyst for Haaretz, Amos Harel. Amos, just fill us in at the start before we get into all the questions of the wisdom of this, but just what actually is the plan on the table to expand operations in Gaza?
Not all details have been released to the public, of course, but it's quite clear that this is a different scenario. You may recall when Eyal Zamir was appointed chief of staff of the IDF in the beginning of March, he kind of promised the politicians that if he's ever told to come back to Gaza, he has a different plan and a different solution than what the IDF has essentially failed to do in the past, beating Hamas and forcing Hamas to release all the hostages. And Netanyahu, of course, found that extremely useful because you could both promise that something like this is on the horizon and also blame the generals if this doesn't succeed. Now, once Israel decided to stop the ceasefire and resume attacks on Hamas on March 18th, it became quite clear that at one point or another, if the negotiations on the hostage deal are still stuck, there will have to be another move because Hamas did not flinch, and we haven't seen any major changes in Hamas's position or any kind of flexibility regarding their demands for a final hostage deal. And now the cabinet, I think that was late Sunday evening, has released a statement saying that it has decided to finally defeat Hamas, that it's preparing to call in hundreds of thousands of reservists, And although this may take some time, they're keen on both defeating Hamas, and also this is something that Smotrich said publicly, this time it's for keeps. We're not only going to invade most parts of the Gaza Strip, but we're actually going to keep those parts, which also means, in a way, some form of forced transfer. This is what Smotrich and Ben Gvir have been dreaming about for months now, and also the return of the settlements. Now, the IDF does not necessarily agree to that. It's not the top goals for the army, and yet this is where things might be heading. This is why excuse me for quoting myself, but then again, nobody else would do that. What I wrote when I warned about the outcome of a possible operation this week in Haaretz, this is what I was worried about, that we can get stuck in our own Vietnam for a long time, that the army and the politicians would promise a clear victory, but that we would never get there. We would be stuck in the new version of a Palestinian or Vietnamese mud. And we've been through that in Lebanon, if you recall, in the 80s. The question is whether everybody is necessarily on the same page, because, okay, this is what Smotrich and Ben Gvir want. It's quite clear that Zamir, the general, has second thoughts about the whole plan, that he now understands that it's quite a lot harder to do than he imagined. And as usual, we don't know where Bibi is. The fact that he's saying one thing on his strange videos, now, interviews with his spokesperson, which is quite a new method of talking to the public, doesn't mean that he actually means what he's saying. So we'll still have to wait and see where this is heading.
And just say a word or two on this plan about corralling the population into a very small area and humanitarian aid and so on, because that's obviously got a lot of attention around the world.
So they're not giving us the full details, as I said, but they are hinting that this would include, a new operation would include occupying most of the Gaza Strip and then pushing the population, Smotrich has said that publicly, to a small part of the strip on the southernmost point, the area around Rafah, south of what is now known as the Morag corridor. That would mean 2.2 million people squeezed into about 20% of the territory. And this is going to cause huge problems, mostly, first and foremost, for the public in Gaza, but also for the state of Israel, because except for Trump, I assume that most Western leaders would find this very hard to support or agree to.
We'll get to the infrastructure about the humanitarian aid that's in this plan, but we should probably stress this has not yet been implemented. It's only been agreed on by the Israeli cabinet. And this kind of leads into my question to you. How much of this is a hold me back tactic, which is to say we are going into this radical plan if Hamas does not, somehow decide to be more flexible and go to this hostage deal? I mean, how much of this is tactic and how much of it is real strategy?
Well, you've been covering those different military operations almost as many years as I have. We're familiar with the old trick. It's always a sort of a game of chicken, and never do you realize in advance where Israel is actually heading. There's always a possibility of escalation while negotiations are held, and usually Netanyahu prefers it that way. You keep all options on the table until the last moment, and then you decide whether by flipping a coin or otherwise. So even now, I assume, I'm pretty sure about the generals. At least most of them, are not too keen on trying this, and actually the possibility of failure is quite terrifying for them. Regarding Netanyahu himself, it's quite evident for me, after following this war for the last 19 months, that it's all about political survival, that the only thing he cares about is maintaining the fire burning. The fire needs to keep burning, because otherwise we'd start discussing what actually happened on October 7th, whether his attempt for a judicial overhaul actually split the country apart and led to this disaster in some way, and what about his corruption trial? All of these discussions are hardly held because we're still stuck in this war for so long. Look at the Channel 12 broadcasts since October 7th. You're still, I think you're broadcasting news since 2 o'clock in the afternoon?
12.
3 o'clock?
Noon.
12? Okay. So this is the only game in town for a long time. And from Netanyahu's point of view, that's perfectly effective. This is better than the alternatives.
You say that Netanyahu prefers this to anything else, but you do have an issue here when your biggest political problem is ultra-Orthodox in your coalition want an exemption. You are now, as the Israeli government and the military, calling up reservists for either a third or a fourth round for this expansion of the war. There's a real issue here whether or not reservists will show up because of the trajectory of the war, because of what the hostages are going through, and other questions of these exemptions. So I'm not sure it's such a simple world for him, the more the war actually is prolonged.
To begin with, it's his problem, not mine. But it's quite clear that he's stuck in a way. But in order to survive, he needs to continue in this path. It's true that this means a lot of compromises, and it means that he keeps playing between the ultra-Orthodox side camp in his coalition, which keeps demanding full exemption for their voters, and the ultra-right-wingers like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir who want the war to continue. And it's true that many of the reservists are stuck in between. Some of them vote for the Netanyahu government, others voted for the oppositions. But I think it's true that many of those reservists are having second thoughts about the whole thing. It doesn't mean that they won't show up. In the end, political objection to the goals of the war, I think this would remain a minority among reservists. Even if you don't agree to the war, you still have this commitment, this obligation to the guys, to the people who served with you for the last 10 or 20 years. It's a very hard step to take, announcing I'm no longer serving because I have political reservations, whether it's about the fate of the hostages, about threatening their lives with our military action, or whether it's about the sharing the burden of the service. So I think the most common reason for reservists not to show up would be the fact that this is a war of attrition, that many of those reservists have served for 100, 200, and even more than 300 days, and that they're fed up by now. They still believe in the country. Some of them still believe in the war itself, but some of them are saying, look, I've done my part, time for somebody else to do it. Perhaps somebody who lives in Bnei Brak, for instance.
So you've explained to us the political logic for the Prime Minister, why he needs this to continue, the fire to keep burning. Just explain, to the extent there is any, what the military logic or thinking would be of such a plan, given that, as you said, Hamas have not flinched. 18 months of pounding of Gaza has not made Hamas give the Netanyahu the surrender he wants. What do those military planners who support this idea think will be achieved by corralling the population into a tiny portion of the Gaza Strip, the whole population? We haven't got onto the very restricted situation with humanitarian aid. Why do they think, okay, this will be finally the blow that makes Hamas say, okay, we survived till now, but now we're going to wave the white flag?
There's an old military saying in Hebrew, I'll try to translate, which says what doesn't work while applying force would work if you apply more force. Now, it's half cynical, of course, but this is the tendency, this is the army's DNA. You need to be taking the initiative. You need to be leading the war and not responding to it. And the generals themselves are frustrated by now because many of them have promised us better results 10 or 12 months ago. And yet, even others are probably in support of a full-scale deal, of reaching a hostage deal right now, in spite of the very massive concessions we need to give to the other side in order for this to happen. And they would tell you, if the government is forbidding the army to go that way, we need to do something else. And there's some logic to that. In the end, how would you judge the first hostage deal on November 23 or the second one in January 25? I can't claim, although I'm not a supporter of continuing the war, I can't claim that that the applying military force was absolutely ineffective. If Hamas hadn't paid a price, it wouldn't have agreed to release all of those hostages. Still, my personal assumption is that even if we apply enormous pressure right now, even if we occupy 70, 80% of the Strip, I'm not sure that would be enough. We're dealing with radicals here, with religious zealots, people like Muhammad Sinwar. He has a tunnel vision. Excuse my pun, but this is the way he sees that. He's all for the struggle. His older brother Yihya was already killed by the Israelis. He was one of the masterminds behind the massacre on October 7th. I'm trying to psychologize a bit, but for him, even if he dies now, then he's dying a martyr's death. He's fought the brave struggle against those terrible Zionists, and I don't think he minds, and I don't think he cares so much about the Palestinian population above ground, which is suffering so much.
I actually want to pull the thread of what Jonathan is talking about, which is what is the military logic. And when we, there's another friend of the pod who we all respect very much, Michael Milstein, who is one of Israel's leading experts on Hamas. And what he says, and of course, we're putting the hostage issue aside here because I think that is the only issue that has a very clear time frame. You need to save these people and you need to do it urgently. But what he says is eventually the only thing that will help in this war, this very long war against Hamas, is some sort of occupation, Israeli military occupation. He doesn't mean rebuilding settlements of parts of the Strip, and to having this lasting for years. Is there any logic to that?
First of all, there's logic to anything Michael says. And yet we're arguing like Talmudic scholars here about what actually Michael intends. My view, and I spoke to him recently, is that he understands as well that the first and foremost goal of the war by now should be the release of the hostages. Because as we spoke about this in the past, the hostages don't have all the time in the world. The two main goals of the war are not synchronized. And if we wait some more, hoping that in sometime in the future, 3, 5, 6 months, Hamas would cave in, then the question remains, how many hostages would actually remain alive? And we know a lot of them died in captivity. Our colleague Ronen Bergman at the New York Times published 2 months ago that about 41 Israelis died in Hamas captivity. These are very high numbers. Even now, as we talk, there's a debate in the last few days because of what Sarah Netanyahu said, because of what Netanyahu himself said, because of what President Trump said last night. It appears that there are 21 and not 24 live hostages. Now, there is some misunderstanding about the whole issue, and as far as I can tell, this is not about free hostages who died recently. It's more about the possibility that since there was no sign of life, no proof of life in recent months, that the intelligence community in Israel assumes that these people have actually died, perhaps a long time ago, perhaps even on October 7th. And yet the numbers are gradually going down. And it's pretty clear that if the IDF enters most of the Gaza Strip with all its might, there's no way to protect those people. Also, we know from the past, from experience, that actually the guards are actually treating the Israeli hostages much worse whenever there are bombings close to them, whenever there are family members who die, and so on. I think the lid has been lifted a bit, and most of the hostages who came out actually now speak quite bluntly about their experiences. There's always the case of sexual harassment. Hardly anybody acknowledges the full details of the ordeals they suffered through, and so on. But if you listen carefully, you understand that these people are going through hell. And okay, they're back. They're all saying we can't rest until we know that our brothers there are coming back. But think of the people who remain there, who saw some other hostages be permitted to leave, and were left on their own in those tunnels. Excuse me for being slightly emotional over this, but I think it's a moral issue as well. And I think it has a lot of influence on Israeli society. In the end, it goes back to the question of solidarity and what we actually think of our brothers there and how much we're obligated to save them. And it's quite clear that the government no longer cares, that many, not all government members, but when you listen and when you interview some of those ministers, you see that gradually in some of the backbenchers, you see that they're gradually trying to prepare the public for the scenario that these people are never coming home. And this is for political reasons, because again, if you ask most of the public and if you ask most of the experts, and including the generals and the security analysts inside the army and Shin Bet and so on, they think that a deal is possible.
The point you make about ministers, it was explicitly, wasn't it, spelled out by the Prime Minister himself last week, saying the supreme goal is the defeat of Hamas. In other words, saying that it is no longer even paying lip service to the idea that getting the hostages back straight away.
And actually, it's interesting because the IDF chief of staff is saying the most important thing is to bring back the hostages, which is a direct sort of contradicting what the Prime Minister is saying.
But I wanted to get on to a bit about another aspect of this. Reaction around the world, people are just appalled by this proposal, and they're clinging to the idea actually Yonit raised, which is maybe it's just a threat and a tactic to get Hamas to do a deal rather than contemplating what would be involved in actually forcing the whole population into this tiny area of what was already a tiny area and a crowded area. But one particular point of controversy, is putting it very mildly, is about aid and this notion that there's some plan being discussed that would see 60 trucks going in a day to certain 4 or 5 kind of ring-fenced areas, humanitarian hubs where aid would be possible. You take Hamas out of it completely. These are kind of sealed areas, what we understand of this proposal, and that designated representatives of families are allowed to come forward and collect aid. You tell me, is it correct that these reports that there are people within the IDF who say this is just an unworkable plan, that it's far too little, for one thing? It has to be at least 300 trucks a day, if not double that number. But also this idea of representatives of families, imagine handling the bureaucracy of that and making sure that, the right people only got through. It seems to me a completely unworkable plan, just designed to avoid headlines, given that people are warning of dire famine and starvation in Gaza. But what are you hearing about this, and what's your read of it?
So I'm not familiar enough with the final details of the plan. And actually, as we speak, we can tell our listeners a secret that we're conducting this conversation on Thursday afternoon. And President Trump last night hinted that there will be news regarding Gaza. Of course, the first hope among families of the Israeli hostages was that there is some kind of deal in the making. Unfortunately, it's not this, as far as I can tell. And what we assume is that the administration would announce some kind of resumption of aid to Gaza, according to the details you mentioned. And this is mainly because Trump needs to go to Saudi Arabia next week, to the Gulf states. He's expecting to sign deals worth trillions of dollars, and he's not going to make his hosts too angry about what's going on in Gaza. They would like this to end completely, but at least what he's going to try and promise them is that aid would be resumed. And yes, this is heavily debated inside Israel. Of course, Ben-Gvir this week on Sunday, correct me if I'm wrong, Yonit, actually said that we should bomb the food reserves there. So he wants to starve them to death. This isn't what's going to happen, and you already see Netanyahu taking a step back. But yes, is this plan fully workable? I'm really quite doubtful, and we've seen in the past that there have been many problems delivering the aid. It's quite different than what the international media has described, and we've seen many times Hamas use all kinds of propaganda tricks, showing ill kids, showing people waiting for food, and being desperate about this and so on, while there were other eyewitness accounts and information saying that Hamas in fact was controlling a lot of the supply. But this is different. This is 2 months later, after the aid has been stopped, and if the plan comes through, then what we'll see is, as you said, we'll see forced evacuation of most Gaza Strip residents to a very small area. And if these are the conditions that we begin with, then I think a disaster may lay ahead of us.
We're talking, as you said before, we know what President Trump's announcement is about Gaza. But since we are talking about Trump and his upcoming visit to the region, I would want to sort of zoom out and talk a little bit about what this week started with, not only the cabinet decision on Gaza, but also a ballistic missile fired from Yemen and falling in the compound of the Ben Gurion International Airport. Then Trump surprising Israel again, we should say, by striking a deal with the Houthis and essentially, correct me if I'm wrong, signaling to the region that you can strike a deal with the United States and continue to attack Israel, which is problematic in itself. I guess what I'm trying to lead into is to ask you, how much is all of this? So how much should we be concerned about how this is a harbinger to what might happen with Iran, with the U.S. and Iran over Israel's head, really?
Well, Yonit, I think this is extremely troubling from an Israeli perspective. The Yemeni a case as it's on its own is not the most important issue in the world or the region right now. Israel has dealt with that for quite some time. It's true that the Eilat port is actually out of business for the last 19 months. It's true that recently the Houthis resumed attacks, launching drones and sometimes ballistic missiles, but to most Israelis, it's not much of a big deal. The problem was, of course, what happened on Sunday, because this immediately meant that many foreign airlines have canceled their flights for the next 2 weeks, and it may go on the whole summer. And that's quite a step back for the Israeli tourism industry and for Israelis who want to go abroad. This is a big deal for us. And yet, as I said, the Yemeni threat is not the number one on the agenda. But it goes back to show you that what we've known about Trump all along. He may be instinctively a friend of Israel. He may like Netanyahu personally some days of the week. But it's not about this. This is about the Trump show. It's about keeping viewers interested the whole time. It's about having something new to say twice or 3 times a day, because otherwise you don't get attention. Otherwise your brand's worth is going down. And all of this is much more important than helping Israel or protecting Israeli interests. So Yemen is just the beginning. The main question is when a decision will be made regarding the Iranian deal. It's not so far away. And it's quite clear. Again, Netanyahu would not say that publicly. We'll have to see how he reacts if Trump indeed signs a deal. But there's a clear possibility of a new deal between the US and Iran. It would not end the Iranian nuclear project completely. The threat would remain to some extent, and Israel probably would have to live with that, because imagining that Netanyahu would go on his own against Iran, he didn't do that under Obama, he didn't do that under Biden. I doubt whether he would try and challenge President Trump over that. And I should quote 2 people that you need to know very well, Eyal Hulata, the former NSC, in Israel, and Amir Eshel, the former commander of the Israeli Air Force, who wrote an article, I think 2 weeks ago, on the Foundation for Defense of Democracy's website in Washington. And they said, their headline said, "The road to Tehran is open." They claim that actually the conditions now for an Israeli strike have never been better because of what Israel did last October while destroying the strategic anti-aircraft Russian systems around Tehran and around the nuclear sites. So theoretically, Israel is actually more prepared than it was in the past to strike. And we do know, mostly from the international media, that the military preparations are being made for a long time. Will Netanyahu actually make a decision to strike under these circumstances with Trump saying no, it's a red light? I doubt it. Netanyahu, in the end, we've said that in the past, he's the sum of all his fears. It's true that he wants to be remembered as the great protector. Will he risk it fighting Trump directly? I find it hard to imagine. Again, but we've seen the limits of my imagination in the past.
It just makes me wonder whether anybody there, the sight of an American president who Netanyahu had put all his chips on, now cutting separate deals and being prepared. You know, we always said he's transactional. He's doing that now. He's made his separate side deal with the Houthis, it seems, as you've just been talking about. He could do that with Iran. I just wonder whether you detect any sense among policymakers, well, you know, maybe it wasn't such a smart idea entirely investing everything in Donald Trump, partly because you just imagine how the whole Netanyahu sort of machine would be whipping itself up into fury if this was Joe Biden or Kamala Harris doing this, you know, saying we're going to look after ourselves as far as the Houthis are concerned. Israel, you can still be in the, you know, Houthis' crosshairs. We're going to cut our own deal. Off we go. We're going to the region without visiting Israel. I mean, imagine if Kamala Harris had done that.
We don't need to imagine. We remember what happened to Barack Obama when he made that decision in 2008.
I mean, yeah, in 2009. Yeah, I mean, it just does make you wonder. Does he get any sort of pushback even from his own side on this at all, or is everyone still all in on Trump?
Not from his own side. It's a very Jewish sentiment, saying "I told you so." Loudly, on repeat. And this is what the Israeli left or the anti-Netanyahu camp is doing for quite some time. But then again, Netanyahu, part of the policy or part of the strategy is never to admit mistakes or defeat. And neither are his followers willing to do that. But I have to say that, again, there's not much fun in this funeral. But watching this and watching the people mostly in Channel 14 having this crisis of faith regarding Trump is quite enjoyable to see, because what you have, these people were anti-Biden all along from October 23 to October 24, elated when Trump won on November 24, angry at Trump on January because of the hostage deal, happy again at February because he invited Netanyahu and talked of a forced transfer in Gaza and that beautiful Riviera nobody seems to mention anymore. And now again, daddy's fighting with mommy. What should we do? This is the struggle they have right now. And you can see them actually sweating when they discuss that because they're not familiar with the guidelines anymore. Who should we attack today? Is Trump an enemy or still our friend? What should happen regarding that? So again, these are miserable times, but let us enjoy a little bit of that.
We are talking about Trump and just how many times he has surprised Netanyahu, right? I mean, we mentioned this, the Houthi issue, also talking about direct talks with Iran. Perhaps Netanyahu knew of it, but he couldn't prevent it. To say nothing of direct talks with Hamas. Remember the Adam Bowler story. So I guess this leads to two questions. One, do we know what does Israel know what Trump is planning for his Saudi trip and what, if there's anything official that will be announced? And also, does the defense echelon in Israel, the security establishment, how concerned are they when it was clear that in the first Trump administration you had this direct line between Dermer and Kushner? Now that doesn't exist, or at least exists, let's say it's much less effective. How much is Israel concerned about this, the security echelon?
So we don't know, and I think the security echelon is concerned. And you've mentioned Dermer. The point of contact in this administration was no longer Kushner and Ivanka because they're otherwise occupied making money for the next generation of little Trumps. Dermer's point of contact was Michael Waltz, who was NSC until last week, until he was kicked out and moved after the signal scandal with our friend Jeffrey Goldberg. And he's now out of the picture. And it was published in the Washington Post that Trump has lost faith in him, not only because of the signal scandal, but because there were reports that Netanyahu was trying to maneuver or play Waltz in Israel's favor. Netanyahu gave a sort of a non-denial denial, saying, we haven't dealt with that intensively. Yet it's quite clear that Dermer was in charge of not operating Waltz, but talking to him. So what's the channel right now? People who talk to Americans who work for the Pentagon or the State Department describe a story of very sad places, office buildings, corridors with rooms that are still empty because nobody's been hired since January. And this is problematic for the Israeli MOD and the Israeli army. We need somebody to talk to on the other side. And one thing I should also mention, that was mentioned briefly at that press conference in April when Trump hosted Netanyahu and dropped that bomb regarding the Iranian negotiations. He also briefly discussed the security assistant. He said $4 billion a year, while it's in fact 3.8. And then he said, congratulations for that. That was quite a hostile remark. It wasn't. It didn't give you a sign that Trump is happy about security assistance for Israel. It was a sort of a veiled threat that maybe in 2 years' time, Trump would have other ideas about the level of support that the United States should give Israel. So these are, I think, indeed challenging times on all fronts, but also on the American-Israeli relationship.
I'm very glad you drew attention to the point about Mike Waltz. I think a lot of people reported it as about Signalgate or also about this, he wanted to be more robust on Putin. There was obviously a Middle East dimension there too. Some in the administration did not like the fact that by all accounts he was coordinating quite closely with Israel on the matter of joint strikes or potential Israeli strikes on Iran. And that was, one of the reasons that appears counted against him. I don't think that's been certainly here reported perhaps enough. As always, you have enlightened us. We are very, very grateful. Amos Harel, thank you.
Thank you.
Always great to talk to Amos because you feel like at least you have everything organized in boxes. Like you're smarter on where this is heading. You're not necessarily happier, but you're smarter. That's always what I think when we talk to him. I think that last time I think there was some criticism that he voiced about the new chief of staff, Eyal Zamir. And here I think it's really interesting. We also mentioned it, but sort of to what extent is he his own man? And you see that when the government is making a lot of saying this is the military plan, it's the chief of staff's plan, what we're planning for Gaza. But you see when he says something like the most important thing is bringing back the hostages, that's not what the prime minister is saying. That's important. When he says you have to enlist, everyone has to go into the military, that's also complicating things for the government. So I think that's an interesting place to be at. And of course, everything else that we were talking about, be it Yemen, Iran, Trump, Gaza, everything else.
Yeah, no, all of it is very important. I noticed at one point he talked about, the reaction of the world apart from Trump. And I do often wonder to what extent policymakers in Israel have now, got to the point where the only person they care about is Trump. And so Europeans can condemn and be appalled by, as I have to tell you, they are, by this proposed plan, and especially the gloss put on this proposal or plan from Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister. I think a lot of people who are really in the weeds on Israeli politics think of Smotrich as a minor figure. Outside, it's reported that he's the finance minister. People think of that as the second or third most important in government, because that's what it would be in London or Berlin, who is saying that these are territories that will be kept, that the people, the Gaza will be totally destroyed. Israel will hold on to the areas it will take over, and the population will, in some kind of voluntary way, he says, be moved to third countries. Voluntary, but not really voluntary. This is, to my mind, unconscionable and an appalling thing to talk about. We can only hope that what you asked about is indeed what's going on, that this is just a tactic designed to put the squeeze on Hamas. I have to say, and I thought Amos did it, put his finger on it by saying there's this notion in the DNA of the army that if something fails with force, then just do more force. This is coming to look like the old cliche about the definition of insanity. Something that has not worked for 18 months. To do it again just harder, you've hit your head against this wall, now ram your head into the wall instead. It doesn't work. It never can work. Because, as we've said before, Hamas don't mind when the people of Gaza suffer. That's not a problem for them. That's not where they're coming from. They're not trying to protect the civilian population of Gaza. So each time you hurt Gaza, hoping that will make Hamas tremble, I don't see the evidence for it. And the evidence of the last 18 months is that they can withstand it. And I think Amos made that point well by talking about, for example, the remaining Sinwar, an ideological fanatic who is ready to go down if he can say he dies a martyr's death. So I was really wanted to push Amos on what is the military logic here. And I think we heard it's kind of cross your fingers and hope that by hitting something harder, something new happens.
I want to do something that isn't talking about the war or ballistic missiles from Yemen, but rather a conversation about a cultural recommendation from you and me. What do you think? Is that a good idea?
Why don't we? Because we need to break away from this diet of really quite difficult news and pretty grim news most of the time. I'm realizing that as I'm speaking, my recommendation is in some ways related to all of this. People who see it will know it's a much richer offering. We had on the podcast a few months back the great British theatre director, Sir Nicholas Hytner. Nick Hytner was on talking about this new play, Giant, which the giant of the title, it refers to the children's storyteller Roald Dahl, who had, well, I was about to sort of euphemize it, there's no need. He had anti-Semitic views of Jews, and they surfaced in a very, in this play, brilliantly dramatic way in the early 1980s, after the first Lebanon War. He reviewed a book about that war and just said some pretty heinous things about Jews, and then went further in an interview afterwards. The play imagines brilliantly how he had got to that point, and just the people around him and how they were publishers, agents, his wife-to-be, second wife-to-be, tiptoeing around him, handling him. At the centre of it is the brilliant performance by John Lithgow. You will not see a better acting performance. But amazingly, I gave a rave for this when it was on first time round. I saw it again the opening night less than a week ago, or about a week ago. And I'm delighted and astonished to say it's even better. I don't know how they've done it. Somehow it's even more intense, even more dramatic. There are some very powerful conversations there about Israel, about Jews, and at the center of it, truly a spellbinding, mesmerizing performance. It's brilliantly directed and acted and written. I could not recommend it more highly. Go and see Giant if you can.
I might be in London soon. I don't know if you've heard, but this podcast
heard.
I'm co-hosting has this live event.
I've seen some promotional
material. Are the tickets
material.
completely sold out, or if I had a good English friend who'd help me out, nudge, nudge?
Yes, I think you may be able to. Whether I think that is some magic that we may be able to pull off, but for I don't know for everyone else. I think there's always a way, and it's worth it. Even if you have to somehow perhaps pay over the odds to get, not you, if people have to pay over the odds, it's really, really worth it. I don't think you'll have a better night in the theatre anytime soon. And the talk is that it will make its way to Broadway. So American listeners, do not feel taunted or tantalized by this. I think it's coming your way.
Yes, they'll just remain taunted by your accent. But we will love to have another reason to have Nick Heitner on the podcast again. So I'm going to say that my cultural recommendation is not very far from the news either. Apologies. But this is a quite remarkable exhibition I saw last week. The story of the exhibition itself and of its curator, both fascinating. It's called Shoah October 7th, 23, and it's curated it's mainly Israeli artists and the art they made after October 7th. Some of it is art from before, but incredibly relevant. And the curator is Simon Durbin. He was actually the right-hand man for Banksy for many years. And that in itself is really interesting because we know his views on Israel. Simon's are very different. He volunteered in a kibbutz Magen, which is actually very close to the Gaza border when he was 18. He's now in the process of making Aliyah again, and he's the one who gathered all these very talented Israeli artists together. I have to say that just to walk through this, and it's not it does have its disturbing moments and its comforting moments for sure, but the thought that you have not only is this pool of talent of Israeli artists, but also when is the point where trauma becomes art? And I think that, for example, after 9/11, it took longer for American artists to perhaps maybe digest, maybe use this as therapy even, and to make art. I think it took less time for Israelis, perhaps because they're very much used to this kind of reality. But it really is a breathtaking exhibition that I would recommend.
Yeah, and what you mentioned, the story behind the story, Banksy, obviously, a very vocal critic of Israel. I think he supports the sort of BDS campaign. The idea that his partner in the art world was somebody who is now making Aliyah, emigrating to Israel. An amazing twist on events. So look, 2 recommendations from us. We're going to get to our awards. Crowded field, I think, in the chutzpah realm. I'm going to offer as a nominee Linda McMahon, formerly of Worldwide Wrestling, WWF, and now the Education Secretary in the United States. Obviously, she's got time on her hands because the Department of Education is being abolished. But she has sent yet another letter to the leadership of Harvard, issuing more threats, more complaints about the way they run themselves, a litany of complaints. What's really interesting is missing in the letter is any mention of campus anti-Semitism. The reason why that's significant is you'll recall the justification, and I would use the word pretext, for Donald Trump's war on the universities has been the problem of anti-Semitism on campus. We've talked about it a lot here. In saying that the Trump administration uses it as a pretext is not to say that it's not a real thing. It is a real thing. Just they were using it in quite a cynical way to advance their own agenda, which is against higher education and its key institutions because they represent some kind of check or curb on presidential power. She writes this whole long letter, litany of things, saying you've got to do this, you must do that, complaining about all the different, super left-wing things they're guilty of, supposedly. No mention of anti-Semitism. I think the mask has slipped a little bit, and Linda McMahon's letter has sort of revealed that it was only ever a ploy, and their conviction on anti-Semitism was pretty flimsy. It was instrumental, and I think Linda McMahon gets a chutzpah nomination for that letter to Harvard.
And the interesting thing is, if you use the actual anti-Semitism on campus as your pretext, that would have been a better case because, to be honest, I mean, we all think that there was, that justifiably there were students, probably faculty, who felt, unsafe And again, if you're using or you're writing about that, that would actually perhaps be a stronger case. But that's
although
just,
probably not a strong case to start cutting funds to, the biochemistry department or whatever. But no, there was something to be said on anti-Semitism, but they're not saying it. They are instead you going on all their usual sort of favorite hobby horses.
Yeah, so we haven't, I think, mentioned Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, enough in this episode. So we wanted to correct those wrongs in our chutzpah department. Perhaps we've given him the chutzpah award in the past, but never a double chutzpah award for two things that he said this week. One has to do with the teachers' strike. There's a cut for all government workers. The teachers went on strike because of this. And then he wrote on Twitter calling them to show some sort of national responsibility. He said, I can't imagine at a time when hundreds of thousands of reservists are leaving everything, those who educate our children would go on strike and harm the war effort. Now, we should mention some of the teachers are reservists, actually many of them. Some are partners of reservists, and perhaps they don't need to have a lecture about this issue when they're cutting the salaries for teachers who really aren't paid enough in this country. And this government is showing exemption to or trying to exempt ultra-Orthodox from military service and showing no urgency to cut funding anywhere else. Another thing that Bezalel Smotrich said at the last week at the torch lighting ceremony after Emily Damari, who we had a special message from her last week on our podcast for unholy listeners. He looked at, she was lighting the torch, and he wrote again on X, he wrote he was very moved by her and how much bravery and how much power and how much spirit. This is a man who literally voted against the hostage deal that released Emily Damari. So it's difficult to have it both ways. I mean, it's nice that you're happy that she's home, but you should perhaps remind Israeli voters that you're the one who thought that she shouldn't be. So that's our chutzpah nomination. Should we go to Mensch just to have something more,
We should.
Nicer
breathtaking chutzpah performance from Bezalel Smotrich there. A double, but I think the Emily Damari message absolutely takes the biscuit. Before we get to our Mensch nominee, you've got one.
Takes the biscuit? Is that the British version of takes the cake?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Absolutely
I don't think I've ever heard that.
Yes.
I'm very excited by that.
And of course, biscuit in America means something else completely. So, let's not even go down that one. Before we get to your very good Mensch nominee, a mention, friend of the podcast, previous guest, British film producer and TV executive Danny Cohen. And just before, you're going to tell us why we're going to mention him, but I just thought we should say, because some of the listeners by now may have seen a puff of white smoke from the Vatican. We won't have, because as so far it hasn't yet happened. But if there is a new pope, we say b'hatzlacha from unholy to His Holiness, but we don't yet know if that's happened. But tell us why a mention for Danny Cohen.
So I found this so interesting how there was this, I think it was a headline in Politico, the Cardinals are watching conclave for guidance on the actual conclave on how to vote. The film was produced by Danny, and it just, it's heartwarming to think that such a prominent Jewish producer produced the film that now all Cardinals are watching to show them as a guide, to have this guide on how to, vote for and choose the next.
It's slightly up there with Jews writing Christmas carols, isn't it? White Christmas by Irving Berlin. It's got something of that in it. But no, it's a nice mention for him. But our Mensch nominee.
Also, your savior was Jewish. Just saying.
Don't say "your" to me. Like suddenly I'm your Christian co-host. What's going on here? Okay, we'll have to have conversations about that. Can you just give our Mensch nominee?
I will.
We've got a very good one.
I will do our Mensch nominee quickly. I think that the Mensch award this week should go to Ziv Aryeh. Ziv Aryeh is a football manager. I'm sorry that I'm just saying the word football to you after the Arsenal game this week. I apologize.
You really are
but he is the
wind
manager
me up today. We've had Christian, now it's Arsenal's defeat in the Champions League.
Ziv Aryeh is the manager of Hapoel Yerushalayim in football. And this week, he was talking after his team was victorious, and he was standing in front of the cameras, and he essentially said, listen, we usually talk about the hostages coming home, and then we do this abrupt transition, and we go on to talk about the game. I don't want to do that abrupt transition anymore. I don't want to talk about the game. He said, I only want to talk about the hostages, and I think, he said, that the Israeli Premier League needs to be delayed until the remaining hostages are home. He became the first high-profile Israeli figure to say that, and it was such a beautiful, authentic moment. It's just someone saying, in my corner of the universe, I can't act like business as usual anymore. That's it. I'm done. We need to bring back the hostages. We should also mention perhaps that Hapoel Yerushalayim was the favorite team for Hirsch Goldberg Poland. So that is also an emotional thing to say. But I think that he deserves the Mensch Award just for saying that.
So we have handed out lots of garlands this week. We are delighted. Remember, we come to London in the form of Unholy Live, 8th of June, Queen Elizabeth Hall. People always say there are very few tickets left. Genuinely, there are very few tickets left. So if you want to come, do book for that. Otherwise, we should say our thank yous.
Well, Sarah, thank yous to Michal Porat, and we shall meet next week.
See you then.